In the pre-dawn darkness of July 10th, 1940, Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere lies awake in his dispersal hut at RAF Horn Church, listening to the breathing of sleeping pilots around him and wrestling with a form of exhaustion that transcends the merely physical, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest seems able to touch, because it stems not from tired muscles, but from a mind that has been forced to process more death, more fear, more adrenaline-fueled terror than human psychology was designed to handle in such concentrated doses. He has been flying combat missions for only a few weeks since France fell. Yet already the accumulation of experiences has begun to reshape his internal landscape in ways he struggles to articulate even to himself. The faces of squadron mates who were alive yesterday but are now simply names on a casualty list have started to blur together in his memory. Not because he didn't care about them, but because caring too deeply about each individual loss would make continuing impossible. And continuing is the only option available, because there is no one else to do what must be done. Within hours, Deere will take off in disguise that are about to become killing grounds of unprecedented intensity, entering a battle that will consume the next 7 weeks of his life, and transform him from a confident young pilot into something harder, more resilient, and simultaneously more fragile than he ever imagined possible. This is the story of the Battle of Britain's opening phase, the weeks between July 10th and the end of August 1940, when the Luftwaffe launched a sustained assault against Britain's defensive systems with the intention of destroying the Royal Air Force and clearing the way for invasion. And when young men like Deere discovered reserves of courage and endurance they never knew they possessed, while simultaneously confronting the terrible reality that courage and endurance alone might not be enough to prevent their nation's defeat. For the next 70 minutes, this is the complete experience of the Battle of Britain's critical opening weeks, not merely as a sequence of tactical engagements and strategic decisions, but as a profoundly human drama where the fate of nations intersected with the psychological breaking points of individual human beings, pushed far beyond what anyone should reasonably be asked to endure. This is the story from every angle. From RAF pilots struggling to maintain sanity under conditions of sustained combat that military psychology had never encountered before, to Luftwaffe air crews equally exhausted but convinced they were on the verge of final victory. From British civilians watching the contrails overhead and understanding that their survival depended on the outcome of battles they could observe but not influence. From commanders making impossible calculations where preserving forces today might mean losing everything tomorrow, and from political leaders watching from London and Berlin as events unfolded according to plans that were already falling apart under the pressure of reality. Most historical accounts tell you that the Battle of Britain reached its crisis point in the summer of 1940, and that fighter command somehow held on despite overwhelming odds. Yet what they rarely convey is the psychological and emotional reality of those weeks. How exhaustion becomes a physical presence that reshapes personality. How grief accumulates until it fundamentally alters how people relate to one another. How fear becomes so familiar that it stops feeling like fear and transforms into something else entirely. How the human spirit proves simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than anyone could predict. And how the experience of sustained combat changes people in ways that they will carry for the remainder of their lives, regardless of whether those lives last decades or mere days beyond this moment. This is not a surface-level narrative of who won which engagement or how many aircraft were lost, but rather a deep exploration of what it meant to be human during those weeks. To make choices under impossible circumstances. To continue functioning when every instinct screams for escape. To maintain hope when rational analysis suggests none should exist. And to discover reserves of courage that no one knew they possessed until the moment arrived when courage was the only option remaining. By the end, you will understand not just what happened during those critical weeks between July and August 1940, but what it felt like to live through them, what psychological toll it exacted, what emotional scars it left on those who survived, and why this battle represented not just a military turning point, but a revelation about the nature of human endurance under conditions that should have broken everyone involved. This is the Battle of Britain, the complete human story. The strategic situation that existed in early July 1940 represented a convergence of military, political, and psychological factors that made the coming battle not merely probable, but inevitable. Though the precise form it would take remained unclear to participants on both sides who were operating with incomplete information, untested assumptions, and conflicting strategic imperatives that would shape their decisions in ways both logical and catastrophic. France had surrendered just 2 weeks earlier on June 22nd, leaving Britain isolated and seemingly vulnerable after the evacuation of 338,000 troops from Dunkirk had saved the army but left it without equipment, without clear defensive positions on the continent, and without any obvious path to victory against a German military machine that had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, Denmark in hours, Norway in 2 months, and France in 6 weeks, creating a pattern of rapid victories that seemed to suggest an unstoppable momentum. Adolf Hitler, watching from his headquarters in the Berhof and later from Berlin, found himself in a strategically ambiguous position that his ideology and temperament left him poorly equipped to navigate. Because while the conquest of Western Europe had exceeded even his optimistic expectations, the continuation of war with Britain represented a problem that could not be solved through the blitzkrieg tactics that had brought such spectacular success elsewhere. Britain was an island protected by the Royal Navy, which remained the world's largest and most powerful fleet despite losses in Norway and Dunkirk. And any invasion across the English Channel would require not just control of the sea, but also control of the air. Because ships attempting to transit those narrow waters under attack from aircraft would be sitting targets for bombs and torpedoes, regardless of how powerful their guns or how thick their armor. The Luftwaffe, which had provided crucial support for ground operations in Poland and France by destroying enemy air forces on the ground, interdicting supply lines, and providing close air support for advancing panzers, now found itself tasked with an entirely different mission, one for which its doctrine, training, and equipment had not been specifically designed, namely the systematic destruction of an enemy air force that remained intact, alert, and defending its home territory. With all the advantages that defensive operations provide, Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, approached the challenge with a mixture of confidence born from recent successes and a fundamental misunderstanding of what would be required to defeat fighter command, because his experiences in the First World War as a fighter ace and his subsequent leadership of the Luftwaffe had given him expertise in tactical aviation, but had not prepared him for the complexities of conducting a sustained strategic air campaign against a well-organized defensive system fighting on its home ground. Göring believed with the certainty that characterizes those whose egos have been inflated by uninterrupted success that the Luftwaffe possessed overwhelming numerical superiority that would allow it to simply overwhelm British defenses through the application of sustained pressure, and that once fighter command had been destroyed in the air and its supporting infrastructure on the ground had been neutralized, Britain would have no choice but to negotiate terms or face invasion and certain defeat. This assessment was not entirely irrational given the information available to German intelligence, which suggested that fighter command possessed perhaps 600 operational fighters compared to the Luftwaffe's approximately 2,600 aircraft, including fighters, bombers, and dive bombers, creating what appeared to be a 4-to-1 numerical advantage that should, in theory, prove decisive. What German intelligence failed to appreciate, however, was the sophisticated defensive system that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Downing had constructed over the preceding 4 years. A system that integrated radar stations along the coast, providing early warning of incoming raids, observer corps tracking aircraft once they crossed the coastline, fighter control centers coordinating interceptions, and squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires positioned at airfields across southern England in a carefully planned defensive network that allowed fighter command to concentrate its forces at the point of attack, rather than maintaining standing patrols that would exhaust pilots and waste fuel. Downing himself, 60 years old in July 1940, and nearing the end of a long military career that had included service in the First World War and decades of peacetime preparation, understood with painful clarity both the strengths and weaknesses of the defensive system he had created. And this understanding generated a psychological burden that would weigh on him throughout the coming battle as he made decisions that would kill specific young men whose faces he could recall and whose families would grieve, all while maintaining the appearance of confidence and certainty that command responsibilities demanded. He knew that Fighter Command possessed perhaps enough strength to defend Britain if resources were husbanded carefully, and if the Luftwaffe could be forced to fight on terms that played to British advantages. But he also knew that any significant error in judgment, any miscalculation about German intentions, any catastrophic loss of pilots or aircraft in a single day might tip the balance irretrievably toward defeat. And this knowledge created a constant tension between the temptation to commit forces aggressively to achieve tactical victories and the necessity of preserving strength for a battle that might extend for months. The pilots themselves, predominantly young men in their early 22nd with an average age of around 23 years, came from backgrounds ranging from wealthy aristocratic families to working-class neighborhoods, united by a combination of patriotic duty, youthful confidence in their own invincibility, and the simple fact that someone had to fly the aircraft and they had volunteered or been selected for this role. But most had not yet fully processed what sustained combat would demand of them psychologically, because the human mind tends to resist contemplating its own mortality until experience forces such contemplation. They had trained for aerial combat, learned the technical skills of flying high-performance fighters, practiced formation flying and gunnery, studied tactics for engaging enemy bombers and fighters, but training conducted in peacetime with clearly defined rules and safety parameters bears only superficial resemblance to actual combat, where the consequences of mistakes are measured in death rather than demerits, where fear and exhaustion become constant companions rather than occasional visitors, and where the accumulation of trauma from watching friends die creates psychological wounds that military medical knowledge of 1,940 was poorly equipped to recognize or treat. Across the English Channel in occupied France, Luftwaffe pilots prepared for the coming offensive, with emotions that combined confidence from recent victories with growing recognition that the battle ahead would differ fundamentally from previous campaigns. Because whereas operations in Poland, Norway, and France had involved close coordination with ground forces, advancing rapidly across territory, where the Luftwaffe could relocate to captured airfields and maintain relatively short flight times to targets. The assault on Britain would require flying substantial distances over water, with no possibility of forced landing on friendly territory, engaging an enemy fighting desperately to defend their homeland, and returning across the Channel with fuel reserves that left minimal margin for error or extended combat. Oberleutnant Werner Mulders, already a highly decorated fighter pilot with victories in Spain during the Civil War and numerous kills over France, experienced a form of existential doubt that he revealed only in letters to his mother, expressing concerns not about his own survival, which he seemed to regard with the fatalistic acceptance common among fighter pilots, who understood that death might come at any moment, regardless of skill or courage, but rather about whether the mission itself made strategic sense. Given Britain's apparent determination to continue fighting despite the hopelessness of their military situation, Mulders recognized, perhaps more clearly than many of his superiors, that destroying Fighter Command would require not just shooting down British aircraft, but breaking the will of pilots who were defending their homes and families, which represented a fundamentally different psychological challenge than engaging enemy forces in neutral territory or occupied countries. Because men fighting to protect everything they hold dear possess reserves of determination that men fighting for abstract concepts of national glory often cannot match when the costs become unbearable. The bomber crews flying Heinkel 111 seconds, Dornier D-17S, and Junkers Ju 88 seconds loaded with high explosive and incendiary bombs faced the most dangerous missions of all because their aircraft were large, relatively slow, and vulnerable to fighter attack, despite defensive armament that included multiple machine guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. And they knew that once British fighters penetrated their formations, the casualty rates could be catastrophic, with entire aircraft and crews of 4 or 5 men disappearing in fireballs or spiraling down, trailing smoke to crash into the Channel or into English fields. The civilian population of southeastern England, living directly beneath the aerial battlefield that would soon develop, had spent the weeks since Dunkirk in a state of suspended anxiety that combined pride in the evacuation success with fear about what would come next. Because while the government and newspapers spoke confidently about Britain's ability to resist invasion, the reality of French collapse after just 6 weeks of fighting had shattered pre-war assumptions about Allied military superiority and raised uncomfortable questions about whether British forces would prove any more capable of stopping German panzers than the French army had been. Mary Thompson, 43 years old, mother of 2 children aged 14 and 11, whose husband served in a reserved occupation as a railway worker and thus remained at home, spent her days maintaining the routines of domestic life while simultaneously preparing for a future that might include invasion, occupation, or death from bombing. And this combination of normalcy and apocalypse created a psychological tension that manifested in small ways, like snapping at her children over trivial matters or lying awake at night listening for the sound of aircraft engines and trying to distinguish between the steady drone of British bombers returning from raids on occupied Europe and the irregular rhythm of German bombers approaching on attack missions. The government's evacuation program had relocated hundreds of thousands of children from cities to rural areas considered safer, creating its own trauma as families were separated, and children found themselves living with strangers in unfamiliar surroundings. But many children had already returned home by July because the expected bombing campaign had not materialized during the phony war, and parents found separation from their children unbearable despite the risks. A decision that would prove tragically premature when the bombing intensified in coming months. The Home Guard formed in May 1940 as the local defense volunteers and consisting primarily of men too old or physically unfit for regular military service, supplemented by those in reserved occupations whose civilian work was considered essential, trained with whatever weapons could be provided, which initially meant often nothing more than pitchforks, clubs, and hunting rifles. Though by July, the supply situation had improved slightly with the arrival of rifles from American stocks and limited quantities of more modern weaponry. But regardless of equipment, the fundamental reality remained that the Home Guard would face German paratroops and invasion forces with minimal training, inadequate weapons, and the knowledge that defeat would mean not just military loss, but the occupation of their homes and the subjugation of their families. The political dimension of Britain's situation added another layer of complexity to the strategic and military considerations. Because while Winston Churchill's rhetoric about fighting on beaches and never surrendering captured the public mood and strengthened resolve, the practical reality was that Britain possessed limited means to actually strike back at Germany, except through strategic bombing of occupied Europe and German cities, which caused civilian casualties without clearly hastening German defeat, and through the naval blockade, which would take years to produce significant effects, if it worked at all, given Germany's access to resources from conquered territories and trade with the Soviet Union under terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Churchill understood, though he could not acknowledge publicly without destroying morale, that Britain's best hope for victory lay not in defeating Germany through its own efforts, but in bringing other powers into the war, particularly the United States and potentially the Soviet Union. If Hitler could be provoked or persuaded to break his pact with Stalin, and that Britain's immediate task was not to win the war, but simply to survive, long enough for circumstances to shift in ways that might create opportunities for eventual victory. This meant that the Battle of Britain carried implications beyond the immediate question of whether Fighter Command could defend British airspace, extending to whether Britain could demonstrate sufficient resilience and military capability to convince potential allies that supporting the British war effort represented a worthwhile investment rather than throwing good resources after bad in a lost cause, and whether Hitler could be convinced that conquering Britain would cost more in time, resources, and casualties than the strategic benefits would justify, potentially leading him to seek accommodation or to turn his attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. These broader strategic considerations remained largely invisible to the pilots who would fight the coming battle, but they shaped the decisions made by commanders and politicians who understood that everyday fighter commands survived, every German aircraft shot down, every British pilot who lived to fly another mission represented not just tactical success, but strategic progress toward the ultimate goal of ensuring Britain's continued existence as an independent nation. The battle officially began on July 10th, 1940. Though historians would later debate whether this date truly marked the opening of a new phase, or simply represented a point in a continuum of air combat that had been ongoing since the fall of France. But regardless of definitional disputes, the reality was that July 10th saw an intensification of Luftwaffe operations over the English Channel and southern England that signaled the beginning of a sustained campaign, rather than the opportunistic raids that had characterized previous weeks. The Luftwaffe's initial strategy focused on attacking British shipping in the Channel, particularly the convoys that transported coal, food, and other essential supplies along the coast between ports. Because Goering and his commanders believed that forcing Fighter Command to defend these convoys would draw British fighters into combat on German terms where numerical superiority could be exploited. And simultaneously, the destruction of merchant shipping would demonstrate British vulnerability and potentially force the Royal Navy to commit resources that might otherwise be used to defend against invasion. The first major engagement of July 10th occurred when Luftwaffe bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, attacked a convoy designated CW9 near Dover. And Fighter Command scrambled multiple squadrons, including Spitfires from 74 Squadron at Hornchurch, and Hurricanes from 56 and 111 squadrons, leading to a swirling dogfight over the Channel that lasted more than an hour and saw both sides claim victories that exceeded the actual losses inflicted. Because in the confusion of aerial combat, where aircraft appeared and disappeared in seconds, and where the adrenaline and fear that accompanied near-death experiences distorted perception and memory, pilots on both sides genuinely believed they had destroyed enemy aircraft that in reality had escaped, damaged, but intact, creating a pattern of overclaiming that would persist throughout the battle and lead to significant misunderstandings on both sides about the actual effectiveness of their operations. For the pilots engaged in that first major battle, the experience revealed aspects of aerial combat that training had not adequately prepared them to handle. Because while they had practiced interceptions and dogfighting, the reality of closing to within 200 yards of an enemy aircraft whose guns were firing back at you, of seeing tracer rounds streaking past your canopy, of feeling your aircraft shudder from the impact of bullets striking its airframe, of watching another Spitfire or Hurricane explode in a ball of flame with the knowledge that the pilot inside had no chance of survival, of experiencing the physical sensations of high-G maneuvers that compressed your body and made breathing difficult and vision tunnel down to a narrow field, of the peculiar dissociation that occurs when adrenaline floods your system and time seems to simultaneously slow down and speed up as your brain struggles to process information faster than conscious thought normally allows. All these experiences combined to create a psychological impact that would accumulate over subsequent missions until many pilots found themselves fundamentally changed in ways they struggled to articulate. Alan Deere, flying his Spitfire in that engagement, found himself pursuing a Messerschmitt Bf 109 and managed to close to firing range, squeezing the trigger and watching his 8 machine guns send streams of bullets toward the enemy aircraft, seeing some strikes register on the fuselage and wing. But then the German pilot executed a tight turn that Deere attempted to follow, only to discover that the Bf 109's superior rate of roll allowed it to reverse direction faster than his Spitfire could match. And suddenly he found himself the pursued rather than the pursuer, with an enemy fighter closing on his tail, and the knowledge that seconds mattered, and that any hesitation would result in his death. The training that had been drilled into him took over, his hands and feet moving on controls with practiced precision as he threw the Spitfire into a diving turn, pulling back on the stick until the G-forces pressed him into his seat, and his vision began to gray at the edges from blood draining away from his brain, then leveling out and looking frantically around to locate the enemy fighter, finding it several hundred yards away and above him, too far for an immediate threat, but close enough that another attack could develop within seconds. His hands were shaking. He noticed with a distant part of his mind that was observing his own reactions, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from the massive dump of adrenaline that his body had released in response to mortal danger. And his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and his breathing came in gasps despite the oxygen mask covering his nose and mouth. All physical responses that were entirely normal, but that nonetheless felt somehow wrong, as though his body had betrayed him by responding so viscerally to circumstances that his conscious mind insisted he should be able to handle with professional detachment. The Luftwaffe pilots experienced their own psychological baptism during these early engagements, discovering that Fighter Command's pilots were skilled, aggressive, and absolutely determined to prevent German aircraft from operating unmolested over British territory. Characteristics that contrasted sharply with the French and Polish pilots they had faced in previous campaigns, who had often seemed demoralized and disorganized, fighting bravely, but without the systematic coordination that characterized British defensive operations. Oberleutnant Werner Mulders, leading his unit in a sweep over the Channel, encountered British fighters and engaged in a dogfight that demonstrated the Messerschmitt Bf 109's superior climbing ability and rate of roll, while simultaneously revealing its limitations in sustained turning combat, where the Spitfire's lower wing loading gave it an advantage. And he shot down one Hurricane during the engagement, but found himself frustrated by the difficulty of achieving decisive results against opponents who seemed willing to accept casualties while continuing to attack German bomber formations with a persistence that bordered on suicidal recklessness. The German assessment of that day's operations concluded that significant damage had been inflicted on British fighters, with claims of aircraft destroyed exceeding actual British losses by approximately 3-1. A pattern of overclaiming that would lead German commanders to believe they were a triting fighter command at a rate that would lead to collapse within weeks, when the reality was that British losses, while painful, remained sustainable as long as pilot training programs continued to produce replacements and aircraft production maintained or exceeded loss rates. For Air Chief Marshal Dowding, watching the casualty reports and aircraft availability figures arrive at Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, the mathematics of attrition warfare presented a stark picture that transcended the tactical successes or failures of individual engagements. Because what mattered was not who won today's battle, but whether the rate of loss could be sustained over weeks and months of continuous operations. And the early indicators suggested a sobering reality, that Fighter Command was losing aircraft and pilots at a rate that could be maintained for perhaps 2 to 3 months before reserves were exhausted, which meant that the strategic clock was ticking, and that every day the Luftwaffe continued operations brought Britain closer to a breaking point that would leave the nation defenseless. Throughout July, the Luftwaffe continued its attacks on Channel shipping and coastal targets, while gradually increasing the intensity and scale of operations, probing British defenses, testing fighter commands' response times, and attempting to draw British fighters into combat under conditions favorable to German forces. Though the results remained frustratingly inconclusive from the German perspective because Fighter Command's losses, while significant, showed no signs of accelerating toward collapse, and British pilots continued to contest every incursion with a determination that suggested their morale remained intact despite mounting casualties. The psychological toll on pilots of both sides began to manifest in ways that medical officers and squadron commanders struggled to address adequately, because military medicine of 1940 lacked effective frameworks for understanding or treating what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions, post-traumatic stress, and the cumulative psychological damage that results from sustained exposure to life-threatening situations where death is not just possible, but probable. For a significant percentage of participants, RAF pilots developed their own coping mechanisms, ranging from superstitions about lucky scarves or particular aircraft, and to gallows humor that transformed horror into material for jokes to the consumption of alcohol in quantities that would be considered problematic under normal circumstances, but that provided temporary relief from memories and fears that could not be processed through normal psychological channels. Some pilots found that they could no longer sleep despite physical exhaustion, lying awake, replaying missions in their minds, and imagining alternative scenarios where they had been shot down, rather than surviving by chance or skill that seemed inadequate to explain the difference between living and dying. Others developed tremors in their hands between missions, involuntary shaking that they struggled to conceal from squadron mates and commanders, because admitting physical manifestations of psychological stress meant risking being grounded or labeled as lacking moral fiber, terminology that suggested cowardice, rather than recognizing the normal human response to conditions that exceeded evolutionary adaptation. The bonds that formed between squadron members became simultaneously stronger and more fragile, as pilots learned to care deeply about comrades while maintaining emotional distance that would allow them to continue functioning when those comrades died. Because total emotional investment in relationships made grief unbearable, while complete emotional detachment made the isolation of combat unendurable, forcing pilots to navigate a middle path where they cared enough to maintain human connection, but not so much that each loss destroyed their ability to continue fighting. The technical and tactical evolution of the battle proceeded through a process of adaptation, as both sides learned from experience and modified their approaches based on what worked and what failed. Though the pace of this learning curve varied between organizations and individuals, with some lessons being absorbed quickly, while others required repeated, painful demonstrations before they were fully internalized. Fighter Command discovered that the tight Vic formation of 3 aircraft flying in close proximity, which looked impressive during peacetime air shows and facilitated coordinated maneuvers during training exercises, proved dangerously vulnerable in combat because pilots had to devote so much attention to maintaining formation discipline that they could not adequately scan for enemy aircraft. And the transition to looser formations with designated lookouts and pairs of aircraft supporting each other represented a significant tactical improvement that reduced losses. Though the transition required overcoming institutional inertia and the preferences of older commanders who had learned their tactics during the First World War, when aircraft performance and combat conditions were fundamentally different. The Luftwaffe learned that unescorted bomber formations, despite their defensive armament, suffered unacceptable casualties when attacked by determined fighter opposition, and that escort fighters had to remain close to the bombers rather than engaging in free-ranging sweeps, which limited the ability of Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilots to exploit their aircraft's superior performance characteristics, but provided essential protection for the vulnerable bombers, whose destruction was the mission's objective. From Fighter Command's perspective, Dowding's system of ground-controlled interception, which used radar plots and observer reports to vector fighters toward incoming raids, proved remarkably effective at concentrating defensive forces at the point of attack. But the system's effectiveness depended on radar stations and communication networks that themselves became targets, as the Luftwaffe gradually recognized that destroying Britain's defensive infrastructure might prove easier destroying Fighter Command's dispersed aircraft. A realization that would shape operations during August as German strategy evolved from attempting to shoot down British fighters in air combat to attacking the airfields, radar stations, and sector control centers that enabled Fighter Command to operate as an integrated defensive system. As July progressed into August, the intensity of operations increased in ways that created cumulative stress on both organizations and individuals that went beyond the immediate tactical demands of any single mission. Because the human body and mind are not designed for sustained operations under conditions of mortal danger, and the physiological and psychological costs of flying 4 or 5 combat missions per day for weeks on end began to manifest in pilot performance degradation that commanders recognized but could not effectively address, because there were no reserves of rested pilots available to provide relief. Pilots found their reaction times slowing, their judgment becoming impaired, their ability to maintain situational awareness declining, all symptoms of exhaustion that would be dangerous in peacetime flying and became potentially fatal in combat, where split-second decisions separated survival from death, and where any momentary lapse in attention might result in failing to see the enemy fighter diving from the sun, or misjudging the distance to the ground during low-level maneuvering. Ground crews worked around the clock to repair damaged aircraft, patch bullet holes, replace engines and components, refuel and rearm fighters between missions. Their own exhaustion, contributing to maintenance errors that occasionally resulted in aircraft crashing due to mechanical failures that should have been caught during inspections, but were missed by men who had been working 20-hour shifts for weeks and whose attention to detail suffered from the same fatigue that affected pilots. The infrastructure of Fighter Command's defensive system showed signs of strain as operations rooms struggled to process the volume of information flowing in from radar stations and observer posts, with controllers making decisions based on incomplete or contradictory data about raid size, composition, heading, and altitude, sometimes vectoring fighters to intercept raids that had already changed course or dispersed. Other times, failing to provide adequate warning of attacks that materialized with less notice than the system was designed to handle. Though overall, the defensive system continued to function well enough that the Luftwaffe could not achieve the air superiority that Operation Ceylan, the planned invasion of Britain, required. The human dimension of the battle extended beyond the pilots and air crew to encompass the civilians who lived and worked beneath the aerial combat, whose lives were disrupted by air raid warnings, whose homes and workplaces were sometimes destroyed by bombs aimed at airfields or dropped randomly by German bombers, jettisoning loads before fleeing back across the Channel, whose sons and husbands and brothers served in Fighter Command or the Luftwaffe, and whose psychological resilience in the face of invasion, threat, and sustained danger would prove as important to Britain's survival as the technical performance of Spitfires and Hurricanes. Margaret Wilson, 26 years old, worked as a radio operator at the radar station at Peveny on the Sussex coast, one of the chain home stations that provided early warning of incoming German raids. And her job required her to stare at cathode ray tubes, displaying the radar returns, and to interpret the patterns of light and shadow that indicated aircraft positions and headings. Then to relay this information to the filter room at Fighter Command headquarters, where operators plotted the information on large maps and controllers made decisions about which squadrons to scramble and where to vector them for interception. The work required intense concentration under conditions of considerable stress, because the operators knew that errors in reporting or interpretation could result in fighters being sent to the wrong location or failing to intercept raids entirely, potentially allowing German bombers to attack undefended targets and kill British civilians and military personnel, creating a burden of responsibility that weighed heavily on young women who had volunteered for what seemed like interesting technical work, but who discovered that they were operating at the front line of Britain's defense system, where their decisions had immediate life or death consequences. The radar stations themselves became targets as the Luftwaffe recognized their importance to Fighter Command's defensive system. And on August 12th, German bombers attacked Peveny along with other radar stations along the coast, killing several operators and destroying equipment. Though the damage was repaired within 24 hours and operations resumed with remarkable speed, demonstrating both the resilience of the defensive system and the courage of the personnel who continued operating despite the knowledge that their installations were now targets and that the next attack might be more successful. The Luftwaffe's campaign reached a new level of intensity on August 13th, designated Adler or Eagle Day by German commanders, who believed that the concentrated attacks planned for this date would deliver a decisive blow to Fighter Command by destroying aircraft on the ground and overwhelming British defenses through the sheer weight of numbers. With nearly 1,500 sorties planned against targets, including airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, the reality of Adler fell short of German expectations due to a combination of poor coordination between bomber and fighter units, weather conditions that disrupted formations, and Fighter Command's continued resilience in meeting attacks despite the losses suffered during previous weeks. But the day nonetheless represented a significant escalation in the scale and intensity of operations that would characterize the remainder of August as the Luftwaffe shifted from attacking shipping and peripheral targets to attempting systematic destruction of Fighter Command's infrastructure. For the pilots flying multiple missions on August 13th and the days that followed, the experience transcended individual battles to become a sustained ordeal that tested human endurance in ways that training could not simulate and that psychology could not fully explain. Because while it is possible to be brave for minutes or even hours when adrenaline and immediate danger focus the mind, maintaining that level of courage and performance over days and weeks when exhaustion erodes will and accumulated trauma makes each mission harder than the last, requires psychological resources that most people never know they possess until circumstances demand their use. Squadron leader James Nicholson, flying a Hurricane with 249 Squadron, would demonstrate exactly this kind of extraordinary courage on August 16th, when his aircraft was hit by cannon fire from a Messerschmitt Bf, 110 wounding him in the foot and shoulder and setting his cockpit ablaze. Yet instead of bailing out immediately, he remained in the burning aircraft long enough to shoot down the German fighter that had attacked him, only then parachuting from his Hurricane with severe burns that would require months of hospitalization and reconstructive surgery, an action that would earn him the Victoria Cross as the only Fighter Command pilot to receive Britain's highest award for valor during the Battle of Britain. Though Nicholson himself would later say that he simply did what needed to be done without conscious consideration of heroism or courage, acting on instinct and training rather than making a deliberate choice to remain in a burning aircraft. A response that perhaps reveals more about the nature of courage under extreme conditions than any amount of analysis could provide. The psychological landscape of southern England during mid-August carried a quality that those who lived through it would struggle to articulate for the rest of their lives. A strange mixture of normalcy and apocalypse, where the routines of daily existence continued even as the very survival of the nation hung suspended in a balance that could tip irreversibly with each passing day. Because while mothers still prepared breakfast for their children and shopkeepers still opened their doors each morning and farmers still tended their fields, The sound of aerial combat thundered overhead with increasing frequency, and the knowledge that invasion might come tomorrow or next week pressed down on every mind with the weight of impending catastrophe. This was not the kind of fear that paralyzes, but rather the kind that settles into the bones and becomes almost a companion, a constant presence that reshaped every decision, every conversation, every moment of attempted rest, creating an emotional atmosphere where people learned to function despite anxiety that should have been incapacitating, but instead simply became the new normal state of existence that one accepted because there was no alternative. The government's propaganda emphasized the heroism of RAF pilots, giving them the collective nickname the few after Churchill's speech, declaring that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And while this rhetoric served important morale purposes by giving the public heroes to believe in, and by transforming a desperate defensive battle into a narrative of British pluck and determination, it also created psychological pressure on the pilots themselves, who found themselves elevated to mythic status while they were simply trying to survive each day's missions without being killed. A disconnect between public perception and private reality that some pilots found burdensome because it seemed to demand that they perform the role of fearless hero, rather than acknowledging the fear and exhaustion and trauma that were their actual experience. The Luftwaffe's shift in targeting that occurred during mid-August represented a significant strategic adaptation, as German commanders recognized that attacking Channel shipping had failed to produce the desired attrition of fighter command, and that more direct attacks on airfields and radar stations would be necessary to destroy Britain's defensive capability. Though this recognition came too late to be implemented effectively before other factors intervened to alter German strategy in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic for their campaign. The attacks on airfields beginning in mid-August and intensifying through the remainder of the month created conditions that brought fighter command closer to breaking than at any other point during the battle. Because unlike air combat, where pilot skill and aircraft performance could partially compensate for numerical disadvantages, attacks on airfields destroyed the infrastructure necessary for operations, regardless of how skilled or brave the pilots were, cratering runways so that aircraft could not take off or land safely, destroying hangars and repair facilities that maintained aircraft, damaging fuel storage and ammunition dumps that enabled sustained operations, and killing or wounding ground crews whose technical expertise could not be easily replaced. RAF Biggin Hill, one of the most important sector stations in 11 Group defending the approaches to London, came under repeated attack during late August, with German bombers hitting the airfield multiple times and killing dozens of personnel, destroying buildings and inflicting damage that ground crews worked around the clock to repair. But that accumulated faster than repairs could be completed, creating a situation where the airfield's operational capability degraded. Day by day, despite heroic efforts to keep it functional, the pilots based at Biggin Hill and other targeted airfields found themselves under attack not just when they were airborne, but also when they were on the ground trying to rest between missions, or when they were landing after combat with fuel running low and ammunition expended, adding another dimension of stress to an already unbearable situation. Because the dispersal huts that should have provided brief sanctuary became target areas where bombs could kill pilots before they ever got into their aircraft, creating a sense that there was nowhere safe, no moment of true respite, only a continuum of danger that varied in intensity but never truly ceased. The moral and ethical dimensions that commanders grappled with extended beyond simple calculations of acceptable loss rates to questions about how to maintain pilot morale when losses were mounting. How to balance the need to rest exhausted squadrons against the requirement to defend critical targets. How to decide which pilots would be assigned to the most dangerous missions and which would receive brief periods of reduced operational tempo that might allow partial psychological recovery. And how to continue projecting confidence, certainty about eventual victory when the mathematical trajectory suggested that fighter command strength was eroding toward a point of collapse that might come in days or weeks rather than months. Doubting who bore ultimate responsibility for these decisions found himself criticized by some subordinate commanders who believed he was too cautious in committing squadrons to combat, that more aggressive tactics might achieve better results, that the system of rotating squadrons between quiet sectors in the north and intense combat in the southeast prevented any individual unit from achieving maximum effectiveness. Yet Doubting understood that the alternative to his careful husbanding of resources was the potential exhaustion of Fighter Command's strength, followed by rapid collapse when reserves no longer existed to replace losses, making his caution not timidity, but rather the strategic wisdom that sometimes surviving today is more important than winning today's battle, if survival enables eventual victory tomorrow. The German commanders faced their own moral calculations about the costs they were willing to impose on their air crews to achieve strategic objectives. Because while the Luftwaffe's numerical superiority meant that equivalent loss rates affected fighter command more severely than German forces in absolute terms of remaining strength, the human cost was identical for each individual German pilot or air crew member who died in flames or drowned in the Channel or spent years in British prisoner of war camps. And the letters from families asking about missing sons and husbands represented a moral weight that statistics about loss rates could not capture. The air combat during late August reached peak intensity as the Luftwaffe committed maximum effort to destroying fighter command before weather conditions deteriorated with the approach of autumn and before Hitler's patience with the air campaign ran out, leading to daily large-scale raids involving hundreds of aircraft and resulting in fierce battles that pushed both sides to their operational limits and revealed just how close fighter command came to the breaking point that German strategy sought to induce. On August 30th and 31st, the Luftwaffe launched massive raids against multiple airfields in southeastern England, catching some fighter command squadrons on the ground during refueling and causing significant casualties among both aircraft and pilots, while other squadrons engaged in desperate battles against German bombers and escorts that resulted in heavy losses on both sides, creating a two-day period where fighter command's position looked increasingly precarious, and where some commanders began to question whether the defensive system could withstand many more days of such intense pressure without suffering catastrophic degradation in capability. The pilots themselves, many of whom had been flying continuously since July with only minimal rest, existed in a state of physical and psychological exhaustion so profound that normal cognitive function became impaired, with some pilots falling asleep in their cockpits between missions despite their best efforts to remain alert. Others finding that they could not remember details of combat that had occurred just hours earlier. Still others experiencing hallucinations or dissociative symptoms where they felt disconnected from their bodies and observed their own actions as though watching someone else perform them. All manifestations of minds and bodies pushed beyond sustainable operating parameters by the demands of sustained combat operations under conditions where death was not just possible, but probable for a significant percentage of participants. By the end of August 1940, the Battle of Britain had reached a critical juncture where the accumulated exhaustion of weeks of continuous combat had begun to manifest in ways that went beyond mere statistics of aircraft lost or pilots killed, extending into the psychological and organizational fabric of fighter command in ways that threatened its continued effectiveness. Regardless of whether sufficient numbers of Spitfires and Hurricanes remained available for operations, the pilots were flying 4, sometimes 5 sorties each day, returning to their dispersal huts between missions with hands that trembled from adrenaline depletion and minds that could no longer process the faces of friends who had been alive that morning, but were now nothing more than names on a casualty list that grew longer each day. The airfields bore the scars of repeated attacks. Their runways cratered and patched so many times that ground crews worked through the night just to keep them marginally operational. Their hangars burned or collapsed. Their fuel supplies depleted faster than they could be replenished. Their communications networks damaged by bombing and struggling to maintain the coordination that made Doing's defensive system effective. The radar stations along the coast had been hammered repeatedly, their operators functioning on pure determination despite the knowledge that each shift might be their last if the next German raid proved more accurate than previous attempts. And while most stations remained operational, the cumulative damage meant that coverage gaps were developing that could be exploited by German raids approaching from unexpected directions. The entire defensive system that Dowding had so carefully constructed over the preceding years was being worn down, eroded not through any single catastrophic defeat, but through the relentless, grinding pressure of an enemy that seemed to possess inexhaustible resources and unshakable confidence that a few more weeks of sustained assault would break fighter command entirely and leave Britain defenseless against invasion. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, watching from across the Channel and receiving optimistic reports from Luftwaffe commanders who genuinely believed they were witnessing the final stages of British collapse, felt confident that the air battle would be won within days or at most weeks, clearing the way for Operation Salient to proceed, and bringing the war in the West to a conclusion that would allow Hitler to turn his attention eastward toward the Soviet Union, where his ultimate strategic ambitions led day. They were wrong in this assessment, wrong in ways that would become clear only in retrospect, but they could not know this yet as August drew to a close. Could not know that their intelligence reports drastically overestimated the damage being inflicted on fighter command, or that British aircraft production was actually increasing rather than declining under the pressure of war, or that the psychological resilience of British pilots and civilians would prove stronger than German assumptions predicted. What Hitler and Göring could not see from their headquarters was the human reality of the battle being fought over southern England. The reality of young men continuing to climb into cockpits day after day despite exhaustion and fear, and the knowledge that friends were dying at an unsustainable rate. The reality of ground crews performing miracles of maintenance and repair under impossible conditions. The reality of civilians enduring bombing and invasion threat while maintaining the routines of daily life that provided psychological stability. The reality of a nation that had decided collectively and individually that surrender was simply not an option, regardless of how dire the military situation became, or how rational capitulation might appear from a coldly logical strategic perspective. The Battle of Britain would continue beyond August into September and October, but the critical moment, the point where fighter command either broke under pressure or demonstrated that it could endure indefinitely, had been reached during these final days of August 1940, when both sides fought with maximum intensity, and when the outcome remained genuinely uncertain, balanced on a knife's edge, where small shifts in pilot morale, or aircraft availability, or strategic decision-making (i.e.g.) could tip the entire conflict in one direction or another. On September 7th, 1940, the Luftwaffe would make a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the battle. A decision born from impatience and misunderstanding of how close they actually were to breaking fighter command's defensive capacity. A decision to abandon the systematic destruction of airfields and radar stations and instead turn their fury toward London itself in a terror bombing campaign designed to break civilian morale and force Churchill's government to negotiate terms. That decision and the terror campaign that would engulf Britain's capital and cities across the nation in what would become known as the Blitz belongs to the next chapter of this story. But here at the end of August 1940, with fighter command battered but unbroken, with Luftwaffe losses mounting but confidence still high, with Britain isolated but defiant, with invasion barges gathering in French ports but unable to cross the Channel without air superiority that remained elusive. The Battle of Britain stood at its most critical moment, and the young men who flew Spitfires and Hurricanes over southern England had demonstrated that courage and endurance, when combined with technological innovation and strategic wisdom, could hold against overwhelming force, could survive what should have been unsurvivable, could transform a desperate defensive battle into a strategic victory that would resonate through the remainder of the war and into history. As one of the defining moments when the tide of the Second World War first began to turn against the seemingly unstoppable advance of Nazi Germany.